So I don't believe that there is one specific point or event when playing Dynasty where you can no longer label yourself a beginner and you're just immediately an expert. Instead, I think it's more about your ability to just continually make smarter and smarter decisions every single year, and most importantly, learning from our mistakes. And that's what this video is about today. Mistakes that I see new Dynasty players make all the time, including myself, and how to not make those mistakes in the future. So mistake number one, beginners do not understand the importance of roster construction in Dynasty, and there are a couple subpoints to this that I want to address. The first is building your team around running backs, which might be what a lot of beginners try to do, as it's what we're told to do in our redraft leagues, as the running back position is the most important position in fantasy football on a weekly basis. But in Dynasty, they are perhaps the least valuable position in its entirety. In fact, I would go as far as to say that your RB2 should be the weakest part of your Dynasty roster. Running backs have shorter NFL careers, they have shorter shelf lives in terms of peak production. They are the position that is most likely to get injured in fantasy football, and they're also the position most likely to be replaced out of the blue as the NFL cycles through running backs like they're just batteries in your smoke detectors. But seriously, make sure that you're replacing those batteries at least twice a year. Stay safe out there. What you should be doing instead is building your team around the wide receiver position. Wide receivers are very stable year to year, especially at the top. They have longer career arcs, longer shelf lives in terms of production. They are less likely to get injured, and overall, they're just way better assets to hold on to year over year. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't care about running backs in Dynasty. They're still important seasonally to help you win championships. You just need to be much more selective about which running backs you're rostering and how you're acquiring them. You might be more apt to go zero running back in a Dynasty startup. In fact, I would actually recommend that you go zero RB in a Dynasty startup. It might feel weird to bypass Austin Eckler in favor of like DK Metcalf because you don't do that in redraft leagues, but that's a smarter move to make because Eckler is about to be a 28-year-old running back and Metcalf is still only 25 years old. The second subpoint to roster construction is caring about your starting lineup during the offseason, especially in the first 6 to 7 months of the year. Dynasty is a year-round game, so we're able to trade and make waiver moves and all that kind of stuff all year long. But we don't set lineups in the offseason. So why do you care what your starting lineup looks like in March? Caring about your starting lineup in the offseason just leads you down so many wrong paths that can just ruin your Dynasty team. Instead, your only goal in the offseason should just be acquiring as much value as possible, regardless of the position. Don't be afraid to trade away your RB1 for another wide receiver 1 just because you won't have a starter at running back. Don't worry that your best tight end is like Tyler Conklin and go make a bad trade out of desperation for a better tight end. It's okay to assess your team and try to plug some gaps in your roster, but not at the expense of your team's overall value, because we can fix that problem later in the season with all the value that you acquired throughout the year. And that leads me into mistake number 2, which is drafting rookies based on team need. And we have a saying here at DLF, which is draft for value and trade for need. And you can see how this goes hand in hand with not worrying about your starting lineup. The issue with drafting rookies based on need is you are actively passing on better prospects and better talent just to address a hole in your roster. That is never ever what you want to be doing in Dynasty, especially in your rookie drafts. A good example of a situation of this is what a lot of you actually might find yourselves in this year if you have the 1.01. In basically every league out there, Bijan Robinson should be the 1.01 this year because he's that good of a prospect and a generational talent at the running back position. But if you're in a super flex league and you need a quarterback, you might be tempted to take Bryce Young or CJ Stroud ahead of Robinson because you need that quarterback. No. Don't be doing that. What expert Dynasty players would be trying to do is trade back to the 102 or 103 to take Bryce Young or CJ Stroud, or perhaps even better yet, just trade out of the pick entirely for an elite quarterback. Don't get me wrong, there are times when talent and need align whenever you're on the clock, but if you find yourself rationalizing your draft pick by saying something like,
I really need this position to fill a gap on my team,
just no, stop right there. That's unwise, and you're playing Dynasty like a beginner. Speaking of playing Dynasty like a beginner, raise your hand if you have ever been sent a screenshot of a trade calculator during your trade talks with a league mate, or maybe you yourself have sent that screenshot while talking about a trade. Yeah. No, don't be that guy. See, trade calculators can be great tools for Dynasty players, especially for you beginners out there, but that's all they are at the end of the day, is just a tool. They are no different than any other tool or app or chart, table, anything that y'all use to get an edge in Dynasty. Trade calculators are no different. They are not gospel. They are not the law. They should not be used as a 100% yes or a 100% no on if you are taking a trade or not. The biggest problem with trade calculators is that there's no consensus between the multitude of calculators out there in terms of how players are valued. Let me show you an example using one trade in a normal 12-team Superflex league, which is Dameon Pierce and George Kittle for Tony Pollard and Dallas Goedert. In our DLF trade analyzer, you can see this trade comes out in favor of the Pierce Kittle side by a difference equivalent to about the 112 or 2.01 missing from the Tony Pollard side. But from our friends at DynastyTradeCalculator.com, this same trade comes out basically the complete opposite in favor of the Pollard Goddard side by the equivalent of the 2.03 missing from the Dameon Pierce side. But then I know a lot of you out there probably use Keep Trade Cut as a resource, and they have a Dynasty Trade Calculator as well, which has this trade as almost dead even with a difference equivalent to just Sammy Watkins. And this is just those three Dynasty calculators. There are way more out there that would have various opinions on this one specific trade. And I'm not saying that any of them are right or wrong. They're just tools trying to quantify how the people that work at those sites value all of these players. But if I'm being honest, the only person's opinion of how players should be valued is by the person who has that player in your league, because every league is its own market at the end of the day. So if you're trying to buy like DK Metcalf because someone like me told you to go buy him for 1 first, but that person in your league still wants 2 firsts, then that's the price that you have to pay in your league. Calculators can only get so far because at the end of the day, they're just a tool in your toolbox, just like everything else. And the last mistake that I see people make all the time, and I think it's the worst thing that you can do in Dynasty, and that's trading away all of your draft picks. So often I see teams that are just completely dead in the water. They have a bunch of worthless veterans on their team that they thought would be productive, but then ended up not being. Any young players that they do have are like Zach Wilson, Kyle Phillips, David Bell, those types of guys. And the worst part about their teams is they have no draft picks in the upcoming class and possibly even next year's class as well. If there is anything that I want you to take away from this video, it's this part right here. You ready? There are only 2 ways to improve your roster in Dynasty: trades and rookies. The reason why draft picks are so valuable is because they are the only assets that are capable of doing both. They never lose value, they never get injured, they don't take up a roster spot. They are the most liquid assets in Dynasty, and it's not even close. So what happens when you trade away all of your draft picks is you now lose all of your future flexibility and limit yourself to improving your roster just by trading the players that you have on your team. And in doing so, you open yourself up to so much unforeseen risk, you can't even imagine what would happen in the future. The players that you thought might do well actually don't end up producing well. Players get traded in the NFL, or worse, they get cut. Players get hurt. Suspensions happen. Arrests. Brian Robinson literally got shot in the leg before the season started last year. Damar Hamlin may never play football again because of probably the rarest medical issue to ever happen in a game. The NFL itself will happen. Life itself happens. And limiting your roster to only one way to improve is like jumping out of a plane with only one parachute. But don't worry, if you found yourself in this situation with no draft picks, or maybe more specifically, no first-round picks, I found the best way to get those picks back while still maintaining production on your roster. So click this video right up here to see that in action for the start of the 2023 offseason.